Good evening. I'm back, and so is my focus on military history. Specifically, it is the October 2025 issue of the Journal of Military History, which I just finished reading. Usually it doesn't take me that long, but I had a lot of distractions with work and household stuff, medical stuff, all the stuff that happens when you're an actual working adult with some adult responsibilities. So it took me a little longer to read the articles this time around, as opposed to my video covering the July 2025 issue. And in a way, that's good because I was able to devote more time to thinking about them and analyzing them. So, without further ado, the first article is titled Between Disruption, Violence, and Accommodation: The Quartering Process in Palermo, 1580 to 1650. And this deals not so much with military strategy or anything that military historians tend to luxuriate in, but it's more social history, in which military decisions by the Habsburg Spanish authorities had to make decisions. Now, quartering troops among the civilian population in their homes is going to be problematic. The British found this out when they quartered British regulars in homes in Boston prior to the American Revolution, ended up being one of the leading events that when the revolution broke out in 1775. The United States did quarter troops in Koblenz, Germany after World War I as part of its occupation duties as one of the allies in the Rhineland. But it's not something that you see quite as commonly in recent years as you might have in the 16th through the 18th century. And the author here, Aitor Aguilar Esteban, goes into the Habsburg solutions of building barracks to keep the troops amongst their own, away from civilians, try to keep them from engaging in violence and crime against each other, and maintain discipline. It's an old, early modern problem that resonates through the centuries right up to World War I and immediately afterward. And yeah, the American Constitution, the Third Amendment, and the Bill of Rights explicitly bans the federal government from quartering soldiers on American civilians in peacetime. It's never been reviewed in the courts. It's never been interpreted. It's just accepted as is. It's that obvious and that accepted. But it took a long time to get to that point. And Aguilar shows that it was a long drawn-out process, focusing on Sicily in this case, and that barracks were basically better than inflicting your soldiers into civilian homes. It's definitely well worth the read, and it has some good detail too on the fortifications and defenses of Palermo at the time. So yeah, and it's social history more as much as military history, and social history is important. Many of us have read Richard Evans' work on the Third Reich. He's a preeminent social historian whose work also touches into political history. And as a political scientist, I can really see the value in this approach. And I see Aguilar's article really kind of following in the common tradition with the Third Reich trilogy. And it goes off in another direction in another place, but social history remains important, including to military historians. The second article is by Margaret Sutton Berry, and it's titled Freedom of the Hills, to the 10th Mountain Division and the opening of the vertical frontier. And again, we're getting into social history here. She analyzes the composition and the worldview of the men who founded the 10th Mountain Division in World War II. In the beginning, primarily upper class Ivy Leaguers, especially from Dartmouth, plus ski instructors. The National Ski Patrol was instrumental in recruiting members of the division, and they went on to have a sterling reputation in Italy. They also had a different outlook than your average American infantry division. They weren't just more capable, they also tended to think of themselves as an elite, something they proved through actions. And further, they were in some ways a societal elite coming from the rich, the educationally privileged. And she does talk about some of the people who joined. I think it's a little bit of a reach from her framework. For example, she talks about New Yorkers, New York City, people who joined who were definitely not of the upper class, and as she says, had never seen the snow before, which is a little misleading because every time I've been to New York, it snowed. I think New Yorkers, New York City people know what snow is, but the inference here is they didn't know what virginal, freshly fallen powder snow looked like, and then had the experience of skiing over it. So that's sort of the inference. She also puts the division into the context of the closing of the American frontier. That yes, Frederick Jackson Turner said the frontier was closed. That all the empty land, as she correctly points out, empty of Europeans, but full of Native Americans, all that empty land had been settled, the frontier's been closed. However, as she says, he didn't look up. Turner did not look up, and the mountains, the peaks of the mountains, the slopes were more of a frontier than is sometimes let on. And the men who founded and served in the 10th Mountain Division certainly, through her analysis, saw this as a frontier. And they had a common viewpoint as well with European mountain soldiers in this way. And I think there's a lot of validity here. However, there's some things that come across as a little, I'm going to say gratuitous, but maybe they are. For example, she repeats something that a lot of my students say, and that is that after the war, the GI Bill favored white veterans above veterans of color and minorities. And it's sort of thrown out there with not a lot of no evidence, just like my students sometimes say it. And I really, really wish she'd been backed up a little more. It's an important point where she emphasizes the elite status of the soldiers even before the war, their elite status during the war, and then afterwards. So this racial dichotomy, this difference between white and black and other soldiers of color is really kind of important. It's just sort of thrown out there. I would love to see some additional evidence here, just an example, with a citation, of course. She just sort of tosses that out. There's another thing, too, that I wish had been caught by the editors or the peer reviewers, where she refers to a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army as an enlisted soldier. Now, if we're dealing here with the Journal of Military History, not the Journal of Amish Studies, so I would figure that the editors, peer reviewers, and the author herself certainly should have recognized that a lieutenant colonel of the United States Army is a field grade officer, not an enlisted man, even if he's a Mustang, even if he came in through a recruiter, put his hand up, and came in as but private. No, he's an officer. So that's something that sort of jumped out at me as undermining the credibility a little bit. And it's something that definitely should have been caught. Nonetheless, the article does have its value. And again, this is social history to a large extent. She doesn't go into strategy, tactics, operations, or the real concern of professionals, which is logistics. It's about who's in this division, where did they come from, and what were their perspectives. That's more in the form of social history, and there it does have value. So yes, it's a good article, but keep your eyes open and don't just accept this viewpoint about the GI Bill and veterans benefits after World War II. I'm not doubting her. I just want to see more evidence. Just an example, just a citation, something like enrollment and financial aid to historically black colleges and universities would work. But it's one of these things that's put out there as common knowledge, accepted fact, but some of us would like to know more and would like to see some solid evidence. Now, the third article is again social and political history, and this is titled When Lives Were Cheap as Chickens, Dark Histories of the Barrio During the Japanese Occupation of the Philippines by Greg Bankoff, Marie Beatriz de Gulanao, David Lozada III, and Camille Silva. And what this looks at is the Philippines, the rural Philippines during World War II, especially the Japanese occupation and the relations of the people with both the Japanese occupiers as well as Filipino collaborators and the guerrilla resistance, which was unusually strong for a Pacific country in World War II. The Philippines had a very strong guerrilla movement, and it was a force to be reckoned with, and something that people trying to get by in their lives had to deal with just as much as they had to deal with the Japanese occupiers and their puppets. Now, the basis of this is a series. The primary sources are a series of papers compiled by the Philippine government upon independence. And these narratives, let me find the name here. Now, these are titled the Historical Data Papers, HDP. And the historical data papers were compiled by people who lived in the barrios, the villages, usually people like school teachers or leading citizens. And they tried to compile first-hand primary source accounts of people's experiences. And the value of this article is that much of the post-war attention on the Philippines, on relations with collaborators with the Japanese, it's centered on the big cities, especially Manila. It's natural. And the people who lived at the countryside, literally the boondocks. That's a Tagalog word that English has adopted. The people who lived out there in places like Boondock Province were neglected. Now, the HDPs, the historical data papers, are flawed in one way that the authors point out, and that's they weren't compiled in a uniform manner. They did not have standard interview questions. They did not have a regulated format. Now, social scientists may turn their nose up at this, but historians can really see the value in it as well. And I think that this is important for giving a voice to the previously neglected, voiceless, the rural, poor population of the Philippines, many of whom were just trying to get by. They did not have an ideological commitment to either the pre war Philippine government, supported by the United States, which had promised independence to the Philippines. They generally did not have a ideological love and devotion to the Empire of Japan, and they were really pretty well knocked about by everybody, collaborators, Japanese, Philippine guerrillas, you name it, and they were just trying to survive in a very, very harsh political environment. And this is where I really see the value. That we're seeing how the rural poor, the farmers in the Philippines, reacted to this enormous stress and disruptive influence in their lives. They were the ones who had to put up with all this, and they got far, far less attention than even the collaborating elite in Manila, for example, Jose Laurel, the puppet president of the Philippines. These rural people were given far, far less attention by academia, so the authors are filling in another blank space here. This is followed by an article by Nick Kaput on the invention of the kamikaze, dissent and resistance in the Japanese military. Again, there's a strong social element here, not about tactics or strategy or research and development going into suicide weapons, although that does come in a tertiary manner. What he looks at are the men who actually got tasked with flying aircraft into ships, and also their superiors, mid-level and even upper level. And we have a popular images of the kamikazes as going into it quite willingly and with an eagerness to die for their emperor, like falling like cherry blossoms, like sakura. And this is the image that we're left with: devoted, even fanatical suicide pilots. And what Kaput does, he gives voice to more of the voiceless, because a lot of what we understand or think we understand comes from senior officers, also comes from the more educated pilots, the ones who came from universities, who wrote their death poems, maybe left something behind. An awful lot of the pilots weren't that way. They basically had to be dragooned into this. That he gives cases of pilots who would fly out, fly the aircraft back, and say, I never saw a ship. They probably did. That being a kamikaze was also something that they had to be forced into, either ordered to do it or coerced in some way. At the same time, mid-level and even upper-level commanders were resistant to the idea. That they saw the duty of a Japanese pilot being to attack the Allies, drop a bomb or torpedo, fly home and do it again. That sending them into combat with the expectation that they would die and that they would follow their projectile and pilot it actually into the ship was anathema. This is a waste of a perfectly good pilot and a perfectly good ship or a perfectly good aircraft. The human bullet idea was not universally embraced, and some officers were very vocal against this, even refusing to order their men to adopt the kamikaze methods. There was also an ethical viewpoint in here, an ethical context that I think Americans especially have totally missed. And this is something we popularly do not associate with wartime Japanese society, and that is free will. That officers who looked askance at kamikaze tactics believed that the only time a pilot should ever direct his aircraft in on a suicide mission was of his own free will, if he saw no chance of getting out of the battle and coming home alive. Then it was up to him to make the decision. Not a commander, not the system, nothing like that. It's an individual decision. An individual and free will are two concepts that even a lot of scholars fail to associate with Japanese society in World War II, but it was there. And a lot of officers saw this as highly unethical. What they believed was you never send anyone into battle if there is even a slight if there's no chance whatsoever of coming back alive. Kamikaze tactics were an acceptance of death. It was ordering someone into a certain death. Now, you could send people into situations where death was highly probable. Survival was improbable. But you always had to have that out, that there's some chance of survival. That they could come home, do it again and keep on fighting. It was unethical to order someone to their death and take that free will decision away from them. There was a huge amount of hostility, according to Kaput, about the kamikaze tactics and the whole special attack program, not just involving aircraft, but also the Kai-10 suicide torpedo and special attack motorboats that were intended to ram Allied vessels. That it was all regarded as desperate, tactically inept, and unethical by a great many officers, some of whom were in position to actually resist. So this is very enlightening, and Kaput has a command too of the Japanese sources. So we're not getting this second or third hand from English speakers, but from Japanese documents themselves, which is definitely a plus and essential to the subject. Coming after that is an article by Liu Zhongkun, opening a new Cold War front, Korean War, POW/MIA campaigns of the 1950s. And he sees this as a precursor to the MIA POW controversies of the Vietnam War. But in his view, the people who expressed concern for American POWs held by the Chinese, maybe even the Soviets, after the Korean War, were using it as a tool to beat up on communism during the Cold War. I think he has some good points. He sheds light on a topic that is not generally covered by scholars. Most study seems to focus on Vietnam. Korea, kind of forgotten. It's the forgotten war in multiple contexts, and this is one of them. So, again, it's a neglected subject that the journal addresses pretty well. You may not agree with everything in there, but you can read it, and you can listen to a thought with that. You can entertain an idea, but you don't necessarily have to accept it. This is why we have debate. And perhaps this is something that's worthy of more conversation. Now, the next one is by Richard R. Johnson, and it's Operation Sky Shield, NORAD's influence on SAC's tactics. Now, Sky Shield was a series of annual exercises conducted by SAC the Strategic Air Command, the North American Air Defense Command, NORAD, and the Army's air defense assets in North America, sometimes with Canadian and British participation. And they would simulate bombing raids on the United States. What happens in the event of a nuclear war? They would ground all civilian air traffic for a short time and conduct a mock nuclear attack. And it ended up being bad news for SAC, that they found out that their favorite tactics and technology just didn't work, that they still believed in the World War II idea of massed bomber formations, B-52s and B-47s this time, using their defensive armament, by this point entirely tail gunners, to defend their formations against interceptors, attack en masse from high altitude, and they'd be able to get home safely, just like they had in 1945 over Germany and Japan. Well, technology had advanced a great deal since then. NORAD had high-speed supersonic interceptors. They had, the Army had Nike surface-to-air missiles. Command and control was a lot different. And SAC found that their high-altitude, high-speed bombers were, in a simulated battle, were shot out of the sky. And this revealed that SAC was not a credible offensive force against the Soviets, who one could expect would be smart, well-armed, and be able to cope with high-altitude attacks. And at this point, too, in late 50s or through 1961, SAC was definitely invested in high-altitude massed attacks. They had bombers that were not real good at going low into the denser air and following the terrain. The B-47, before it was upgraded to be a little more robust, had a tendency to fling itself apart at low altitudes. The vertical stabilizer on the B-52, the early models, was a lot higher and less durable than on the later B-52H. That had a tendency to break. The B-58 supersonic bomber was just terrible at low altitudes. And the XB-70, which was in development for deployment by the late 60s, that would have been a terrible choice for low altitude. That the only way to avoid and evade radar was to go low. They were invested in going high, where they could be seen, intercepted, shot down. What Sky Shield did was show SAC, under simulated wartime conditions, the bankruptcy of their approach. And it forced SAC and decision makers throughout the Air Force into changing tactics. Instead of having masses of bombers coming in at the same time, you'd have single plane sorties. And when they approached the target, that by that point they would be under 1,000 feet, following the terrain. They had developed new tactics for flinging bombs. Drop the bomb and immediately fly off in a high, steep, fast climb to evade the shockwave. And it also sparked the development of standoff weapons like the Hound Dog cruise missile, very early effort at it, that was first designed to take out anti-aircraft assets with a nuclear explosive, and then was developed and tasked with actually taking out the strategic targets. Instead of making the airways safe for bombers, it would be the bomber's mission to deliver Hound Dog, along with a Quail decoy that would simulate a B-52 on Soviet radar and thus attract fire that would otherwise be directed at manned bombers. Additionally, SAC took a good hard look at the liquid fuel ICBMs that they had at the time, the Titan 1 and the Atlas, found them wanting. Curtis LeMay never had much faith in them, and he was probably right that it took too much time to fuel ready and aim them. By that point, you're looking at an attack that would take them out. That the Air Force went into more advanced, quickly deployable, quickly launched ICBMs, specifically Titan II and the Minuteman family. So, as the author argues, using NORAD to, as as a simulated foe accelerated SAC's evolution. And they cut their losses by getting rid of the B 47 altogether. The B 52 was modified to have a smaller rudder and vertical stabilizer. The B 58 orders were canceled, and that was out of service by the end of the 60s. And the Air Force went more for the lower altitude bombers that could penetrate Soviet radar. It's a key element. The Sky Shield exercises were a key element that has been largely neglected. And you can also argue too that NORAD honed its tactics and procedures by going against the best that SAC had to offer them. Now, curiously, as the author points out, one of the conditions of the later Sky Shield exercises was that SAC would not be evaluated. There'd be no score sheet, there'd be no official evaluation of how well SAC did, because SAC was very sensitive to criticism and did not want to undermine its currency and its validity as a deterrent force in any way, shape, or form. But SAC got the lesson. And usually, evolution this type takes time due to bureaucracy and inertia, at least during peacetime. Wartime, it can go a lot faster, and this was simulated wartime. So it is definitely a valuable article in my view. The next one is by Kuan Jen Chen, and it's another article like the one in the Philippines that deals with Asia. And this one is about Taiwan. And it is Imperium in Imperio, G.I. Joe's jurisdiction in early Cold War Taiwan. And the importance here is that it looks at American insistence that U.S. Army and other service personnel, but especially the Army, in Taiwan at the start of the Cold War would be accorded diplomatic immunity. That they could only be tried in American courts by their own people, not by the Taiwanese Republic of China justice system. And to Taiwan, this was grossly insulting. And now, a lot of countries would just accept this, and as the author shows, most did. That, except for some very exceptional violent crimes, that American personnel would be subject to American military jurisdiction. Taiwan, though, had a particular sensitivity about this due to Chinese nationalism as embraced by the Kuomintang Party, the Nationalists, and Chiang Kai-shek. That they had started with a deep resentment of the unequal treaties forced on China by the imperial powers, starting with Britain, France, Japan, Russia. They saw this as deeply insulting to the Middle Kingdom, that they could not have jurisdiction over people on their territory. This extraterritoriality was anathema to the Middle Kingdom. That China was proud of its ancient heritage, its power as an old empire, and to see foreigners being able to basically do what they want without being accountable to China on Chinese territory was massively inflammatory to the Chinese. And remember too, the Guomindang were the nationalists. Nationalism means pride and emphasis, terminal loyalty, as my old professors used to say, who you're going to die for, to your nation. As nationalists, one could expect the Guomindang to find this all to be highly offensive. And it was. Now, in the early 50s, Chiang Kai-shek was desperate for American help, not just to hold Taiwan, formerly Formosa under Japanese rule, but also with the view towards returning to the mainland of China and kicking the communists out of Beijing. Never happened, unfortunately. Never happened. But he was desperate for American help, so and his negotiating position was very weak. The Americans insisted on extraterritoriality, so it took about 15 years to reach an agreement that was beneficial to both sides. For example, Taiwan altered its legal system that previously, if you were charged with a crime in the Republic of China, you were not entitled to legal representation until you were actually charged with a crime by a prosecutor and you were being prosecuted. Then you could get a lawyer. This is complete opposite from the United States, which since really Gideon v. Wells, that 1964, that even if you are in jeopardy of losing one day of liberty, you have the right to counsel. We had, by the end of this period, with the adoption of a status of forces agreement, that we had the Miranda case, Arizona v. Miranda, with the famous Miranda rights that we all saw on TV shows. Taiwan was a bit different. They also had a civil system based on law codes, similar to continental Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, whereas the United States uses a common law system derived from Britain, especially England, based on judicial precedent, based on judges' rulings, even custom, as well as specific laws. So we had some very deep differences as far as definitions of rights and definition of a fair legal system went. So they ended up reaching a compromise where really serious crimes such as undermining the security of the Republic of China, murder, rape, robbery, were all allowed to be handled by Taiwan. You're an American, you do any of those crimes, you're accused of it, good luck with the Taiwanese. That anything else was, the lesser stuff would be handled by American justice. And this is something that is neglected, and I think that there's a really pernicious influence here throughout the historiography to date, and the way that China and Taiwan have been taught in the schools. I will go so far as to say that most teaching that I have seen has been very negative towards Chiang Kai-shek and the Guomindang. An awful lot of scholarship has been that I don't want to say it's pro-communist, but they're much more respectful of the Chinese Communist Party and Mao Zedong than they are of the Guomindang and Chiang Kai-shek. That they neglect that the Guomindang actually had an ideology. and it was the resurgence of China. It was interrupted by both the Civil War with the communists and also by the Japanese invasion. But they actually had a program. They had an agenda and they had an ideology. Also, Chiang Kai shek was not the simplistic, uh, dopey crook that he's been made out in a lot of accounts. I think this goes back to people who became overly enamored with the communists, starting with Edgar Snow with Red Star over China, who was so admiring of the communists that nobody could really compete with them. And I think that he papered over an awful lot of flaws with Mao's system and also its murderous nature. I think that the communists were romanticized in the 1960s with especially in 1968, both in Europe and the United States, as a force for progress. That again, people neglected to look at its murderous nature. Also, the China lobby that had done so much good for Jiang in boosting American support before the war and during World War II. I think there was a reaction to that it was, if anything, too effective. This is my view. That once the cracks started showing, there was a backlash. And after all, too, Chiang Kai shek lost the Civil War. But there's a tendency to just denigrate them. That they were stupid and they were crooks. Now, the historiography has started to change, and the article here reflects that. And I remember going back to 2013 with the book Forgotten Ally by Rana Mitter. And he looked at China, the Republic of China, not the communists, as being concerned with Chinese interests and with Chiang Kai shek desperate to perpetuate his regime. Then they made rational decisions and they had to play off and accommodate allies that did not always share their views. For example, Churchill was essentially devoted to the British Empire. Britain was an imperial power until the loss of India. The Kuomintang ideology was essentially anti-imperialist. In the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the United States were both anti-imperialists, and though allied with Britain, tended to be very skeptical of British interests and the desire to preserve the empire. And Jiang was caught between the two of these. And Mitter makes the argument that Jiang did the best he could with a bad hand of cards. He made mistakes, yeah, but he also had a very difficult situation. And I'll add on it too that even at the height of his power, Jiang and the Kuomintang had some very vocal critics, including his own chief of staff of his army, Joseph Stilwell. Vinegar Joe called him Peanut. And there was a lot of personality conflict there, also between Stilwell and the American air commander in China, General Claire Chennault, that this all undermined our image today of the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai shek. Now, the author of this article gives Jiang some credit for trying to bring the Taiwanese into the perceptions that the mainland Chinese refugees had of their place in the world. That many of the Taiwanese were essentially pro-Japanese, and they viewed their time under Japanese administration quite positively, almost as a golden age compared to what they had gone through ruled by mainland China. And one of the things that John did was bring in the idea that the unequal treaties forced on China were an abomination against the Chinese nation and people, and it should never be repeated, especially the parts about extraterritoriality. Well, the Taiwanese did buy into this, and it resulted in the hostility towards American service people and their diplomatic immunity as a return to the battle days. And for John, too, it's a bitter pill to swallow that he has to go back on this central element of his ideology and that of the Kuomintang in order to accommodate the Americans, whom he needs for the concrete, immediate purpose of maintaining control of Taiwan and hopefully getting back to the mainland and overthrowing the communists. So I think that the author here takes a more realistic view than the popular image that we have of dumb, crooked, incompetent Chiang Kai-shek and the empty-headed Kuomintang, and shows them as actually believing in something and working towards it. And I don't think the word corruption ever comes up anywhere in this article, which was a major problem for the Chinese army and the Chinese system during World War II. So the author remains tightly focused on the relationship between Chiang Kai-shek, Taiwan, the Kuomintang, on the other hand, the United States. So this is, again, it's social and political history. The only one so far that I would say is totally military history is the article on Sky Shield. That's military history. Everything else is social history or political history to a great degree, or diplomatic history, international relations. And as far as the beginning article on Palermo and the quartering of troops, this fits in as well with other work. I'm looking here at Iron and Blood from a couple years ago by Peter H. Wilson, who's a brilliant historian of especially early modern Germany. And this deals with many of the same issues of quartering soldiers in the German-speaking world. And his scope includes Germany, including Prussia, Saxony, the smaller German states, the Austrian Habsburg Empire, and Switzerland. That he looks at some of the same issues that that the author does in the article on Palermo, and a wider scope in a different cultural environment. But I see them as being essentially connected. So, again, I recommend this issue. There are some things that I think could have been caught in editing, including that enlisted lieutenant colonel. Still, I'm glad I subscribe. I'm glad I'm a member of the Society for Military History. And I do recommend it to anyone with an interest in academic military history, including even wargamers. Because the Sky Shield article, the article on Sky Shield, NORAD, and SAC, you can actually see a game maybe coming out of that. Then again, I see a lot of things, maybe because I have a fevered brain. But this is essential reading, and please feel free to subscribe. I endorse them. I'm a member, as I said, and I look forward to the next issue. In the meantime, thank you for your time. I do ask, if you can, to subscribe, share with your friends, put a like on it if you liked it, don't if you didn't like it. But in any case, I appreciate your supporting me with your time, and I'll be back shortly, in a few days, I hope, with another video on either military history or political science, critical thinking, maybe a war game. But again, thank you for your time, your attention, and I'll see you down the road. Bye.